Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm hosting a dialogue between J.C. Beale and James Anderson. James N. Anderson. I think that's important, isn't it, James? To let people know, because there's another James Anderson out there, and even another James N. Anderson, as I understand. Is that correct?
Yes, there are multiple instantiations of James N. Anderson. It's very confusing.
Yeah. Well, we wouldn't want to say that there's some kind of contradiction there, would we? We just want to say that there's two. Okay, so what we're talking about today is the true nature of Jesus Christ. And where this is coming from, this discussion, there was a recent book published by J.C. Beale, the guy below me, and I'll talk more about him in a second. Let me actually put this full screen so you can see. The book is titled The Contradictory Christ. And I can go ahead and just read the back. I've got it pulled up here. In this groundbreaking study, J.C. Beale shows that the fundamental problem of Christology is simple to see from the role that Christ occupies. The Christ figure is to have the divine and essentially limitless properties of the one and only God, but Christ is equally to have the human, essentially limit-imposing properties involved in human nature, limits essentially involving in being human. And so what he wants to say is that there's actually a contradiction in Christ, and that's what this book is all about. I mean, the title, The Contradictory Christ. So the reason why we're doing a discussion on this is because James, was your dissertation on something related to this? Wasn't it about the nature of Christ?
Yeah, my dissertation was on paradoxes in Christian theology, and I focused on two paradoxes, theological paradoxes, one the doctrine of the Trinity and the other doctrine of the Incarnation. So it's really the latter, the doctrine of the Incarnation and a Chalcedonian Christology that relates closely to what JC's been writing about in this book.
And JC, I've interviewed him on the show already, and it was an amazing show. I tried to have him here in person. It didn't work out, but the next one, you're working on a book on the Trinity, as I understand it, and we're going to try to have you here in person. Actually, I want to do more of these in-person interviews. That's something I'm going to talk about in just a few days, actually. We want to start doing more in-person interviews. The stuff online is fun and cool and stuff, but to have someone here and talk to them face-to-face, I think that's how it should be done. And that's how it's been done for thousands and thousands of years between humans. So it's probably the way to go if you can make it happen. And I want to make that happen for Capturing Christianity. We'll talk about that a little bit later, though. So getting on the topic for today, what we're going to do is we're just going to have an open dialogue about some of the ideas present in the book here from JC. And before we get into the actual dialogue between the two of these guys, let me just do a short introduction for both of them. So Dr. J.C. Beale, he's a philosopher that specializes in the philosophy of logic. He's currently a professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and he's also widely known for advocating a glut-theoretic account of logic. That's a non-classical approach, which we'll talk about and he'll explain in just a second. Dr. James Anderson, he specializes in philosophical theology, religious epistemology, and Christian apologetics. His doctoral thesis, as we kind of already mentioned already, it was at the University of Edinburgh, and it explored the paradoxical nature of certain Christian doctrines and the implication for the rationality of Christian faith. If you want to learn more about my guest, just check the description of this video. With that, let's just go ahead and jump right into dialogue, but we're going to start it with JC, just giving an overview of some of the basic concepts here. And maybe what I can do is help you along, and just the start of it, I think, is a really easy way to see, and I kind of read it on the back of the book here, an easy way to see what the sort of problem here is that within Jesus, you've got these limitless properties, which are the sort of divine properties, omniscience, omnipotence. These are limitless, right? There's no limit to God's power. There's no limit to what God knows. So there's these limitless properties, but then also, in virtue of him being a human, all humans are limited, right? We don't have these sort of divine properties as humans. We are limited in what we know. We're limited in our power. We're limited in our goodness. And so there seems to be like a problem here. Like this is a sort of contradiction that it's difficult to see how these two fit together. And so this is the sort of problem of Christology, and this has been something that theologians and philosophers have been working on for thousands of years, trying to make sense of this. And so JC's solution to this is basically just to embrace the contradiction. It's like there's other contradictions that we should embrace, and that's sort of the motivation behind his view, that there's this sort of liar paradox, and there's the return of the liar paradox, or whatever the revenge of the liar paradox, whatever you want to call it. There's multiple iterations of it, and they all sort of increase the complexity of the whole situation. But essentially, there are reasons, according to JC, there are reasons to embrace a sort of non-classical approach to logic, which opens up the door for contradictions being true, which just is, if you just think about that sentence for a second, it's just going to blow your mind. But I think that's some of the background. And JC, fill in any of the details, go into any more depth that you'd like to, and then we'll bring James in.
Yeah. That's right. Well, let me point out too that James's book, Paradoxes in Christian Theology, that is responding to exactly what Richard Cross calls the fundamental problem of Christology, which is, as you said well, it's the very apparent contradiction of Christ, the incarnate God, who, according to standard theology, and that's what both James and I accept, you have one person who's fully God, fully human, and has all properties entailed by being God, all properties entailed by being human. Limitlessness of God, limitations, essential limitations of being human. So what to do? Well, the problem's been apparent for a long time. The blurb on the back of my book is unfortunate in a lot of ways. It sort of sounds like it's making the problem itself clear. The problem, it seems to me, has been clear for a long time, including the rise of heresies. If you read James's book, he walks through in more detail than I do the various responses to the apparent contradiction. One is to say, well, in fact, the incarnation is not one person, but two. There's the divine person, Christ, and there's the human person, Jesus. And Jesus has the human properties, Christ has the divine properties, no contradiction. Puzzlement to have two persons sort of somehow walking around, like that, but no contradiction, not even an apparent one. But that was ruled out as heresy, as that's walking away from the standard account of Christ. Another option is to say that there's one person, but the person really isn't God, just very God-like, a wonderful human being, better than any other human being, but not God. There again, you get rid of the contradiction immediately, not even the appearance contradiction. On the other hand, but that too was ruled out. Flip it around. This is really God, not human, not really human. It's just God appearing as human. And so you don't have a contradiction. Christ literally is God, just appearing as a human. So no contradiction, and so on. But all of the heresies, they are just a history of trying to get around the contradiction of Christ. And if you look at James's book, he makes that case very plain, that you wind up leaving the standard theory, or you wind up with apparent contradiction. And as you said, my view is there are few contradictions in reality as far as science or rational inquiry shows so far. But the wrong view of logic is to think that these things are logically impossible. And when you have a persistent contradiction or persistent appearance of contradiction the way you do in the incarnation, It seems to me like this is a case where the contradiction is true. And in the end, it strikes me as not surprising or radical in a lot of ways when you think, I mean, that there's any true contradiction is surprising, but when you think about, the transcendence of God and the immanence of humanity in one person, the puzzlement that many people feel when they think about the incarnation, whether they are Christian thinkers or atheists or non-Christian theists, it's that this appears to be contradictory. And James and I agree on that. The question is what to do in response to that contradiction. So I'll leave it there.
James, how would you like to come in at this point? Would you like to just give a response to what he's just said now, or would you like to fill in some of the details of your book? Where would you like to go?
Well, maybe the best place to start would be to sort of sum up where JC and I agree, and then articulate some points where we disagree and see where that leads us. So we agree on Orthodox Christology. That is, we agree with the great ecumenical creeds of the Church, the Nicene Creed, the definition of Chalcedon regarding Christ. So we agree on those theological tenets. We also agree, as JC just indicated, that we think that the Orthodox Christology is at least paradoxical in the sense that it appears to be contradictory, or it appears to have contradictory implications. And we also agree that thus far, all attempts to spell out or to resolve that paradox, to try and remove that paradox by reformulating or explaining the Christological claims, are unsuccessful. That you can't, on the one hand, maintain orthodoxy, and on the other hand, remove the paradox, where the paradox here, I'm using the term paradox to refer to something that is apparently contradictory. It may or may not be really contradictory, but minimally it appears, it gives the appearance of contradiction. So we agree on that. I think we also agree, and my position shifted a little bit on this, thanks to JC's work, that subclassical logic really is a live option. Sure.
Hey guys, sorry about that. It looks like we had a technical blip, and this was on my end. I think my internet just completely went out, but what we're going to do is just pick up right where we left off. And where we left off, James was making the point that there are some reasons to adopt a non-classical or subclassical view of logic. So James, just go ahead and pick up where you left off.
Sure, thanks, Cameron. Yeah, so I was just saying that JC and I agree theologically on the tenets of Christology. We agree that paradox can't be removed by clever tricks, because they end up sacrificing orthodoxy, or they just don't work for other reasons. And the last point I was making is I think we agree on the viability of subclassical logic, that there can be a pretty serious case made for truth gaps, propositions that are neither true nor false, and perhaps even for propositions that are both true and false, that is, true contradictions. Now, I'm still a little skeptical about whether there are any of those, but a lot of work has been done defending systems that don't have very absurd consequences. So a case can be made for them. But where we disagree is really on the question of whether the true Christology is indeed contradictory. JC's position is that it seems to be contradictory, and that's good grounds for accepting that it is contradictory, because the true logic, or the correct logic, the one that JC accepts, doesn't exclude contradictions. So he says there's no bar to accepting contradiction. So here's one, and there may be other reasons for accepting it. Whereas I want to resist that move. I'm not persuaded that the best answer here is to simply embrace contradiction and say that this seeming contradiction is an actual contradiction. And instead, what I developed in my book was a model according to which, well, to compress matters somewhat, theological claims are analogical in the sense that a lot of the terms that we use to apply to God are analogical. They don't carry exactly the same meaning as terms we use to apply to created things. And that allows room for what I call unarticulated equivocations. That is, that claims that appear to be contradictory because they have terms that appear to be used in the same sense aren't used in exactly the same sense. But we can't distinguish them. We don't have either the vocabulary or the conceptual apparatus to be able to draw the kind of fine distinctions that would allow us to remove the appearance of contradiction. So another way to put it would be that JC's answer is a logical one, that we should embrace a logic that allows contradictions, and this is one of them. Whereas mine is more of a linguistic and epistemological solution that says there are, well, at least we don't have to accept a true contradiction, and it would be better to simply draw the line at a merely apparent contradiction. So that's where we differ, and maybe we can explore why, the respective virtues of these two different answers to the Christological problem. Is that fair, JC?
Yeah, I think that's pretty spot on. I have.
Before you come in, JC, I just wanted to let the audience know that what we're going to do toward the end of this dialogue is we're going to do some Q&A. So don't put your question in the live chat yet. When you have a question, write it down, put it down somewhere. I'll let you know when to put it in the live chat, but we are going to move to Q&A at some point toward the end of this dialogue. But what I want to do now, turn it back over to JC, and then I'm going to just sort of sit in the background, let you guys discuss and talk, and then I'll be hanging out unless I have any kind of question or clarification type thing. So, feel free to take it away.
Okay. Yeah, Cam, don't fall asleep though, because we might need you to steer us back on track. I just wanted to say that James, the review he just gave is exactly right as far as I can see. I guess I would point out one thing that's terminological, so I don't want to put a lot of weight on it, but sometimes terminology can be misleading, and so I just want to flag it. I don't view the account I give as a logical one. Even though some people call this the logical problem of the incarnation, and they use the same term for the Trinity, I don't really see it as a logical solution in the sense that we have this problem. One option is to change our account of logical consequence, logical validity, and I advocate that we do that. There's clearly a sense in which that's accurate, but the way it's described is inaccurate. I think that independent of theology and many other things, many other theories, we have very good reason to reject the standard so-called classical account of logic. It was never intended to be the account of logical consequence as a universal validity relation in all true theories. It was formulated precisely as an account of consequence for standard mathematics and true standard mathematical theories. And I think it gets things spot on there. But that's compatible with the true account being weaker. James didn't contest that. I just, again, terminologically, it's important to see that I'm not saying, lo and behold, you see the incarnation and now we have to scramble to come up with a new account of logic. That's not the way I see it, and it's not the way James portrayed it, but I've had enough people think that that's what's going on. Rather, we have independent reason for a better account of logical consequence. I still think that there are at least 3 methodological rules of thumb that guide us in the rational pursuit of true theories. One is we want to pursue the complete theory of the given phenomenon. By that I mean for every sentence P in the language of the theory, we want the theory to contain either P or its negation, logical negation. So we want, for every sentence P in the language of the theory, we want the theory to make the claim whether P is true or false. That's one rule. It's a completeness rule. Another rule of thumb, methodological rule of thumb, is consistency. Try to give a consistent account. For every sentence in the language P, don't have both P and its logical negation in there. And finally, there's a third methodological rule of thumb. And this is try to give a simple account. Try to give a natural account of the phenomenon. There are a lot of pockets of reality that don't allow the satisfaction of all 3 rules of thumb. And that's why rational inquiry is hard. Sometimes you give up the consistency one, sometimes the completeness one, sometimes the simplicity one. James holds tight to consistency and completeness, if I understand his position correctly, at least logical consistency and logical completeness, at the cost of a simpler account, because he has to add something about analogical language, about which I hope we'll talk. I have real questions and thoughts on that. And an epistemological branch just to try to accommodate the apparent contradiction in the theory. My view is the best explanation of the strong appearance of contradiction is to buck the consistency rule of thumb. So anyway, that was terminological just on the way James had described it. I'd be happy for James to comment if he has anything. If not, I have some thoughts about the analogical move.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good clarification. I was grasping for some way to describe your solution in contrast to mine, but that's fine. So here's a question I have to begin with, and that has to do with the warrant for accepting any contradiction in the first place. So you've indicated you think that there are some good reasons, some good motivations for accepting that there are some true contradictions. The best known one would be the liar paradox and the various more sophisticated versions that try and rule out or evade the standard solutions. And from what I've read of yours, I think that's one of the major motivations for you accepting a glutty logic. What would be some of the other motivations, or where do you see other non-theological contradictions that would motivate this position?
So I don't think that I don't think that the way to go is to look about the yard and figure out your account of logical consequence only if there are objects in the yard that require it. So I want to be clear about that. I don't take you to be saying that, but I want to be clear that that's not what I think is a good methodology and figuring out the best account of logical consequence. But to answer your question, I think that I think that just about any phenomenon has the logical possibility of being contradictory, has the logical possibility of being gappy as well. And how exactly we decide which account is right, well, if there were a simple rule for that, inquiry would be a lot easier, but there isn't. I mean, how do you decide whether any given claim about anything, forget about gaps and gluts, take any claim, there's a lion behind you, James. You know, okay, you're going to have prior probabilities, you're going to have this and that built up, but that's just a matter of, you know, how you believe this or accept or reject that. How do you distinguish the true sentence? There's a lion before you. There's a lion with pigtails out in the hallway. There's, you know, or your desk toppled over. I mean, there's no simple rule for just distinguishing the true sentences from the untrue sentences, any more than some simple rule for distinguishing the true logical conjunctions from the false ones. There's simply no simple rule. If there were, inquiry would be very simple. Well, a lot simpler than it is, no matter how complicated the rule is. But that's just not the reality of rational inquiry. You ask, are there other examples of gluts? I do point to the liar paradox as a glut. But notice that because I think that there's a logical possibility of gaps, the liar isn't sort of logically forced into being a glut. Rather, again, you fall back on those various methodological rules of thumb. I mean, I mentioned 3, but one of them is you're shooting for a complete account. And when you're trying to give a complete account of truth, you have these sentences in the language, like I'm false. Okay, well, the completeness principle tells us that we should try to have either that sentence in the theory or its negation. But lo and behold, given the nature of that sentence, if we follow that principle, then both have to be in there, just given the way the entailment patterns for truth. So you can't, what the liar gives you is something that you can't be both complete and consistent. You could buck both of them, I guess. But again, here's where the simplicity and naturalness comes in. When you have a sentence that says nothing more nor less than I'm false, and you've got the logical possibility of this thing being true and false, when you're following those methodological principles and you see that you try to give a complete account, so you put the sentence in there, okay, then its negation has to be in there. Put the negation in there, okay, then the original sentence has to be in there. Now you have to step back and say, okay, we can't satisfy all of these principles. So what do? Here you rely on the imprecise but very active rule of thumb that tells you what's the simplest and most natural account. Well, when you got a sentence that says of itself nothing more nor less than I'm false, that sure looks like something that's both true and false. Yeah, you don't have to. Logic doesn't demand this, but it sure does look like the right account. Just as, for example, the truth teller, right? I'm true. Okay. Completeness tells us we should try to decide that or its negation. Well, we can do either, and we can do it by satisfying consistency. But it looks like the most natural account is to keep the truth teller and its negation out. It looks like it's a gap. Okay. My point is that when you follow these methodological rules of thumb, then we wind up treating the liar as a case of a glut. Completely uninteresting glut, but if you're giving the truth about the language and the truth about truth, well, you have to decide this. And I think the most natural account is to treat it as a contradiction. You could look at all so-called vague phenomena as natural candidates for gaps. You could also give a glutty account of vague phenomena, for sure. Some people have argued that that's the better account. But, these things, but compared with the incarnation, it's just any way you try to cut it, and I know you agree with this, any way you try to cut it that doesn't deviate strongly into a different theory and rejects the standard theory, any way you cut it, it looks contradictory. So I guess this is one of these things where you can't satisfy completeness, consistency, and the sort of simplicity, naturalness rule altogether. So my view is it's a natural thing to buck the consistency one. Not on the grounds that, hey, this happens all the time in science. I think it's rare. I think it's, the liar is just a weird sort of thing.
Well, that's kind of my point, I think.
Okay.
That why it seems like a big leap to go from, well, look, the liar paradox. This is, that there are various solutions, but a glutty solution would be very natural, very simple. But that seems a very artificial example of a contradiction. Even if your account is the best account, the most, it has the edge over alternative solutions, to then say, well, now that provides us some warrant for allowing theological contradictions, metaphysical contradictions. That seems like quite a leap. Where I'm coming from is I'm starting from the position that we have a kind of intuition, a default intuition against contradictions. And I think this would be fair to say that if we ask the average person whose mind hasn't been polluted by philosophy, that whether he or she thinks that there can be any true contradictions, can there be statements that are both true or false, they're going to say no. Okay, and then you're going to have to say to them, well, actually, look, there are some good reasons to accept some contradictions. Here's the liar paradox. Let me take you through. Let me give you a little tutorial on liar paradox. So now I've sort of given you one reason to think that there's at least one true contradiction here. But then to leap into the realm of theology and say, and that gives us some justification for thinking that there are contradictions of a very, very different nature than basically a sort of self-referential semantic paradox like the liar paradox. How are you going to bridge that big leap?
Well, of course, though, if you ask the person untainted by philosophy and untainted by theology, can there be one person who's both fully God and fully human? The person's likely to say no. In fact, probably a lot of people will say no, even when they get a little theology and a little philosophy. So we have to be a little careful on how much weight we put on that. Not that you were putting undue weight, but I do think it's worth flagging. And again, I guess I'm just not overly concerned with trying to communicate to a person who's had engaged in no serious theological or philosophical reflection. I think that they have other priorities. As far as Warrant goes, I don't really understand what that is. I should admit. So I worry that we sort of, that I might simply be not understanding based on my lack of understanding of the Warrant. My own view has always been when should you accept something? Well, when you want to decide the matter, and two, you think it's true. The same question, when should you reject something? Well, I don't know, when it looks like it should be rejected. The hard nut in all this is being very careful about the way things look. Again, I think if people step back and really reflect on, and I'm not including you here, given some of the things you said, but I think in general, people reflect on why they think that the sort of standard classical story of logic is correct, they won't come up with good reasons. The best reason they'll come up with is that the truth and falsity conditions for the logical vocabulary, including negation, rule it out. But that's simply incorrect. What you're pointing to is, sure, let's agree that the right account of logic is subclassical. And say somewhere in the FD vicinity, so that we're recognizing both the logical possibility of gluts and of gaps. Okay, now you're saying, well, it's one thing to have the logical option. It's another thing to actually embrace that option for a given phenomenon, and we need Warrant to. I agree with the first part, that it's one thing to have the logical option. It's a very different thing to accept some of those options as the truth about a given phenomenon. I don't accept the thing about Warrant only because I don't understand I just don't understand that. When I was growing up in philosophy, all the talk was about justification. And I always thought, many people were overly influenced by Descartes, who was brilliant, but, just count yourself justified. The real question is, should you hold on to those justified views? Well, yes, unless you've got some good reason not to. I'm highly pessimistic about there being a general, true, and interesting answer to what counts as a good reason to accept something or reject something. I don't think that we shouldn't theorize about it, and try to come up with as best a principle as we can. But I'm really pessimistic. So I don't think I've completely answered you, and I think you're onto an important point. So let me turn it back to you.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. And you're right. What I'm suggesting here is that even if we grant a subclassical logic and we say that logic does not rule out gluts, it does not rule out gaps, Of course, that doesn't then mean that there are gluts and there are gaps. And let's leave aside the gaps for now, but let's suppose logic itself doesn't rule out contradictions. Okay, let's concede that to you. That doesn't mean, of course, that there are any actual contradictions. And we have to then ask the question, well, if there are some actual contradictions, what are they and why should we accept them? And so we can go to the liar paradox and maybe give some reasons for thinking that's the case. But it seems to me that when we encounter a set of claims that give the appearance of contradiction, that is a prima facie reason to reject the conjunction of those claims. If someone, there's some rather radical theologies that I encountered in some of my studies that make claims like God exists and God does not exist. All right, now that's a contradiction on the face of it. Now it seems to me that the mere fact that those claims appear to be contradictory is a reason for me to reject one or other of them. And if I'm being asked to accept some seemingly contradictory claims, I need some strong, we can talk about rational justification, we could talk about warrant. That we'll try not to get into the weeds there, but it seems as though if the appearance of contradiction is a prima facie defeater for those claims, then we need to have some strong grounds for accepting them. Now, that's a challenge that I try to address in my book, because I say, if Christians are being asked to believe that Christ is both one person, fully human, fully divine, and this has apparently contradictory entailments, we're going to need some strong, I use the term warrant, epistemic warrant for believing those claims, and I developed an epistemology according to which those claims are strongly warranted. It seems to me that you're saying, oh, we don't need all that. Or you're saying, my account needs it, but yours doesn't. But it seems to me that you have the same challenge, that if you're believing a contradiction or you're inviting someone else to believe a contradiction, you need to have some strong, call it justification, call it warrant, whatever, for holding those claims. If that's the case, then your account isn't less simple than mine on that particular point. You need that kind of epistemic machinery to overcome the prima facie defeater in the way that I do.
Yeah, okay. That's I see where you're going. And by the way, my nodding is I see it, not I believe it. But actually I do believe a lot of what you said, and I accept it as an accurate way of describing the situation. I guess in the end, I don't think that. So I think that the sort of defeater talk, again, and I'm looking at it not from the weeds, largely because every time I get in the weeds, I just get lost. But I get the general idea that you have some sort of, rule of thumb principles that tell you, other things being equal, reject this sort of claim. Let's just stick with contradictions. I think that sort of prima facie defeater idea is reflected in these various methodological rules of thumb. As I said, there's certainly a consistency one where for no sentence in the language of the theory are you aiming to put both in, or to put it stronger, for every sentence in the language of the theory, you're aiming to keep one or the other out, the negation or the negatum. So I guess that's sort of the idea of a prima facie defeater. I agree that you have to have some good reason to when you have a particular phenomenon that clearly, provably, can't satisfy the completeness constraint, the consistency constraint, and the sort of simplicity, naturalness constraint, just to pick a sort of trio of what I think are prominent methodological rules of thumb. When you have a phenomenon that clearly resists satisfying all three, well, already you've got some sort of, good reason to buck one of them. The question is which one? And this is a balancing act. Again, I don't think, I think that there can be really difficult questions about which one should be bucked. But in the case of the incarnation, rather than try to keep this at the abstract where we've got a gazillion examples to try to accommodate, in the case of the incarnation, you and I agree that there are really well-aiming, well thought out accounts that try to resolve the contradiction. But they don't, while sticking true to the theory. So you and I agree with that. And that, to me, this isn't like in the last 5 years there are a lot of accounts. I mean, this is quite some time. So it looks like you have this perennial problem that resists a consistent account, if it's complete, or even tries to be complete. Why do I throw that in? Well, it's important to remember you can easily get consistency if you chuck out completeness. Or if you don't close things, if you don't respect closing the theology under logic. I know that you're not in that position, but consistency can be cheap. But when you're trying to give the full story, a logically constrained story, you and I agree. It's just every attempt to consistentize the incarnation goes wrong somewhere. And so I just think, what more do you need for, defeating the initial defeater? I'm probably misusing the terms, but so to me, there's no sort of, I can't articulate a precise principle that tells you how to defeat, the methodological rule of consistency. I just think you take these things case by case, you're serious about it, you try hard, and it looks to me like in this case we should. And the
analogical, mind if I jump
stuff,
in?
I have a lot to say, but I won't.
You don't want to say anything about that?
Well, I do, but I don't. I want James to be able to reply, but I do have some questions about the analogical.
Okay.
I saw you come on, Cam, so I didn't want to.
Yeah, so I've just got a couple clarifying questions that I would like to ask. I think, I don't know if it's going to be addressed to both of you, but so far I've been just really enjoying the conversation. I think that it's been very clarifying already. But so I've come up to a point where I'm just like, I don't really understand how this works. So James, help me help clarify this for me. So let's take the two propositions. The first proposition, Jesus is limited. Second proposition, Jesus is not limited. I take that to be sort of the fundamental problem here that we're trying to address. And what you want to say is that there is some kind of apparent conflict. So it does seem on the face of it that both of these propositions are true. But your solution is to say that one of them is indeed false. Is that correct?
No. Well, I wouldn't cast it in those terms because terms like limited and unlimited. I mean, I understand why you would choose those terms, but they're not the sort of standard terms that are applied in Christology. So I mean, in JC's book, he focuses on mutability and immutability. My position is that we can make a claim like Christ is immutable and Christ is mutable, and those statements are both true, okay, because they're both implied by Orthodox Christology, which holds that Christ is divine and human. Okay, so my starting point is to affirm that Christ is one person with a divine nature and a human nature, and this seems to have contradictory implications, such as Christ is immutable in virtue of his divinity and is mutable in virtue of his humanity. Now, I want to affirm both, but what I want to say is that that's an apparent contradiction, not a real one, because there's an unarticulated equivocation in those terms, so that we're not saying that Christ is both mutable and not mutable in exactly the same sense. Now, if you ask me, well, what's the difference? My point is, I don't know, and I can't tell you, but I know that there is some way of more precisely stating these things that resolves the contradiction, that makes it clearly consistent. But we either haven't discovered that yet, or we just don't have the cognitive capacity to be able to make those sort of fine metaphysical distinctions. So there's an appearance of contradiction because of a limitation in our ability to state the truth and to grasp the concepts necessary. So I want to affirm both statements, but I want to say that there's a merely apparent contradiction between them and not a real contradiction. Hopefully that clarifies.
It does. It clarifies a lot. So, and you're kind of drawn to this view because you do see a sort of apparent contradiction, and is that right? What is the motivation behind your view here?
My view?
Yeah, because you see that. Yeah. So is the defeater the defeater that we talked about earlier, where like you just have this sort of intuition that contradictions are not possible. You can't let me use different language, that there are no true contradictions, right? You have this sort of intuition that's sort of always in the background. So you've got this defeater waiting, like looming in the distance, waiting to pounce on any kind of contradiction that pops up, right? So is that some of the motivation that you've got here for affirming the view that you've got, where you've got this sort of unstated, how did you put it? Unarticulated equivocation?
Unarticulated equivocation. That is, there's some sort of semantic distinction that would resolve the contradiction, but we aren't able to articulate it. We aren't able to grasp it. We aren't able to explain it. And in the book, I give some examples of what an unarticulated equivocation might be in sort of non-theological contexts, just to explain the concept. But of course, in this case, if I could say what the unarticulated equivocation was, then I would have resolved the contradiction. So in the nature of the case, I can't do that. I can say that there is an unarticulated equivocation, but we can't specify what it is. The motivation for it. So the motivation for it is, on the one hand, I want to affirm Orthodox Christology, as JC does. On the other hand, I do have a strong intuition that there are no true contradictions, or if there are, then they're highly artificial, and that we should resist any conclusion that accepts a true contradiction. So I want to find a solution that, on the one hand, allows me to affirm Orthodox Christology, affirm these creedal statements, and on the other hand, avoid having to say that they are really contradictory. So that's the main motivation behind it. I think there are some theological motivations as well, but I won't get into those unless we want to do that.
And JC, help me understand your view now, because I think that helps a lot clarify your view for me. Go ahead.
Do you mind if I just, before I clarify my view, can I just respond to that very helpful exchange on James's view, or no?
Is that going to take us down the analogical route? Because I wanted to get to that in like maybe 5 minutes.
Yes, you go ahead.
Yeah, because that's exactly where I want to go after I clarify your view. So your view is just that it's just an obvious, like, you've got these two propositions, and we can use the ones that James outlined, that Jesus or Christ is mutable, Christ is not mutable. And you've got these two propositions that both seem true, but you've got this defeater in the background, and I think that you probably share the intuition that James has and a lot of the viewers watching this have, that there are no true contradictions. So you've got this defeater, but you say you've got a defeater for this defeater. Because why?
Well, I don't use the terminology defeater because I realize that that's a highly technical term that I don't fully appreciate. And I actually think that a lot of that terminology conflates logic, true theory, and maybe a little bit of rhetoric, but also our acceptance, rejection, behavior, and all this. So I get lost in a lot of that. Let me just say, it's not that, I'm sure that it's me and not the discussion, but I'm not saying anything about what's a defeater. I'm certainly not saying it's obvious, but
I think I could articulate it without using the terminology defeater. You've just got this intuition that goes this way, and so when you face an apparent contradiction like this, you've got this intuition, but nevertheless you've got good reasons to affirm both propositions, right? And so maybe in the case where you don't have a solution like the one that James is outlining, and that's why I think that we're going to go to that in just a second, because you in your book you canvass a lot of different options, right? And you say that this one doesn't work, this one doesn't work. So maybe in the case, the shoes that you're sitting in right now, you're like, okay, we've got this apparent contradiction. I don't really want to, because I got this intuition, I don't really want to affirm it just willy-nilly, but I want to go through some of the different solutions. And then if we can rule all of these out, then at that point we say that this is a true contradiction.
Okay. I also don't use the term intuition much, but I get what you're saying.
You're killing me, JC. You're killing me.
No, I know. So here's the thing. Look, this apparent contradiction has been around for a long time. Look at the history of heresy. Look at it's so the apparent contradiction is there. Suppose that for completely independent reasons, you see that contradictions aren't ruled out of the space of logical possibility, right? As James rightly said, that doesn't thereby give you reason to embrace a contradiction. But when the phenomenon itself strongly appears to be contradictory, and despite the many attempts to try to avoid the contradiction, unsuccessful attempts, the contradiction stands as apparent. I just think, okay, I don't know what needs to be defeated and what needs to not be defeated, but it looks to me like this is a case where if we're trying to give the full story of Christ, the simplest, most natural one, the normal consistency principle is the natural one to kick out. Not, hey, now inconsistency reigns, hey, great contradictions everywhere, yeah, great. No, nothing like that. But rather, to get the true and full as we can account of Christ, you can't get complete, full, consistent, simple, and natural all together. What should go? Well, in light of the history of attempts to consistentize Christ, it looks to me like the natural option is to get rid of the consistency one.
What about the natural option of just rejecting that Christ is immutable?
Well, sure.
Like, that's what an atheist would affirm.
Of course, yeah. Look, I'm not going to convince. Look, my view is people who accept that Christ is God, and that's compatible with a lot of heretical views. But they accept that. I don't know. I think that's not because they're convinced by some argument or something like that. That's the work of God. So I'm not saying the aim here is to convince somebody. No, it's to try to give the full and
True.
accurate account of Christ. So one thing you can do is reject immutability. You can reject, and these people who, there's a lot of talk about classical theism and all this stuff. I mean, I'm not sure that people are talking about the same thing when they use those terms. But look, it seems to me like God is limitless, and I use that as just sort of, I mean, any of the reasons the church stamped the immutability of God and the mutability of the immutability and mutability of Christ. You have the same for any of the properties entailed by being human, being divine. So I don't care what we pick, the ones that are explicit in certain conciliar documents or not. But it seems to me like you can give up all that stuff. It's just that, you're rejecting the standard theory. You can resolve the contradiction easily, but not by sticking to the standard theology or Christology in particular.
I'm itching to get James back in on this. He's been sitting so patiently over there. Do you mind if we move now to his solution and just discuss that for, I guess, the remainder of the time until Q&A?
I'd love to, but go ahead.
Okay,
James,
let's do it. James, feel free to fill in any details, any gaps in the story, in the solution that you've already outlined a little bit earlier, but you can repeat it again or you don't have to, but where would you like to go, James?
Sure. Well, let me just say a couple of things again by way of comparing our positions here. One of the virtues that JC points to in his position is that it's metaphysically neutral. It doesn't require you to be committed to any of the metaphysics. You just have to accept the specific claims in question. Christ is human, Christ is divine, and so forth. It seems to me he also wants his theory to be epistemologically neutral as well, in that he doesn't want to get into any of the questions about what warrants these claims in the first place, what would warrant us accepting a contradiction rather than rejecting a contradiction, and so forth. And I understand the motivation for wanting to do that. I just don't think it's possible. I think at some point you're going to have to get into some of the metaphysics of the incarnation, even though there's a lot of mystery there. But I also think that in order to address this problem of apparent contradiction, you are going to have to get into some epistemological matters about on what rational basis we accept claims in the first place, what justifies or warrants us in affirming claims, even in the face of apparent contradiction. So this is not an objection to JC's position per se, but it's just an observation that he is very much wanting to keep both metaphysics and epistemology at arm's length. And it's not as though I want to get into a lot of weeds of these things, but I just don't think you can really avoid them, particularly the epistemological questions. They have to be addressed sooner or later. And JC in his book basically says he's got a very simple epistemology. I think he calls it epistemic conservatism. Basically, if something appears to be true, then you've got reason to accept it. If it appears to be false, then you've got reason to consider it false. That's rather thin gruel for me. And in the book, I do get into more of the meat of epistemology, because I think it's important for defending the position that I take. Okay, so what are some of the motivations for holding the view that I do, that these paradoxes are merely apparent contradictions? The first we've already mentioned is the intuition. I'm going to call it a bias, because that's what it is, or prejudice against accepting true contradiction. So that's part of the picture. Secondly, there's the theological doctrine of divine incomprehensibility that I think once we recognize the kind of being that God is and the limitations of our own epistemic cognitive faculties, we would expect a lot of things about God to be very mysterious to us, even paradoxical. So I think the doctrine of divine incomprehensibility sets us up to expect that there will be some paradoxical aspects of God's nature, and certainly the incarnation. If God is going to take on a human nature, and I think JC agrees with me on this, that this is going to invite an expectation that there are going to be some at least paradoxical claims involved. And the other component that motivates my position is the doctrine of analogy. And that is the view that language about God is analogical rather than univocal with respect to the terms we use about created things. So, for example, when we say that Solomon is wise and that God is wise, we're not completely equivocating. There is some continuity or overlap between those concepts of wisdom, but we're not saying that God is wise in exactly the same sense that Solomon is wise. So there's an analogical relationship. It's not pure equivocation. It's not univocal predication either. It's analogical. And this is well established in the Christian tradition. Aquinas is best known for articulating perhaps this doctrine of analogy, but you get it elsewhere. And since that's already in the Christian tradition, it seems to me that it's fair game to incorporate it into your account of theological paradox, which is what I try to do. And that again allows room for this idea that these paradoxical claims are merely apparent. They're not true contradictions, but there is if these terms, if we could exactly specify these terms that we're predicating of Christ, then there would be no appearance of contradiction. So I'll leave that there because I know JC wants to get in at this point.
Yeah, so that's helpful, and it even though your book provides a lot more details, it confirms that I'm not missing the big picture of your view. But I guess I'll say a couple of comments. There is absolutely no doubt that a strong stream within the Christian theological tradition is to talk about analogical language and the importance of it in talking about God. But the trouble is that nobody's ever really said what it amounts to. I truly have no idea what it's supposed to mean. It sounds to me like it's like, well, here's what we say. We don't know what we mean, but we say this stuff. That's one sort of account. Now, the response is, oh, well, we sort of know what we mean. It's kind of like what we say when we talk about, the wisdom of Solomon, to use your example. But God's wisdom is so far beyond. But what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that the predicate wise actually has to be given a degree theoretic satisfaction or true of semantics, so that you're not just wise. So the predicate wise isn't sort of true of you or untrue of you. It's true of you to degree n. And if that's the account, well, then give the semantics and tell us how that works. My suspicion is that a lot of the reasons people talk about analogical language and the contradictions that the apparent contradictions that fuel that, whether it's coming from transcendence alone or whatever, they're all going to arise again on a sort of straightforward way of thinking about degree theoretic account of analogical language. But whatever, I mean, I've yet to see the details. So maybe it's not that. Maybe instead it is, well, we sort of say these things about God, but it's not a degree theoretic thing. It's really, when we say God is wise, it's truly a different language. We don't know what the language is either. We just know it's sort of somehow in some way related to what we say about created things. But none of this, to me, again, this is just me telling you my limitation here on this sort of account, which is common. This isn't James's. I mean, he's right that the tradition is full of this talk. I just don't know what the talk amounts to, frankly. And not for lack of trying. I mean, it sounds often like it's a different language. I mean, you sort of say God is wise. But you have no idea what follows from that because it's in a different language you don't understand. Or it's a degree theoretic thing, or it's something like this. All I'm saying is I don't even know how to evaluate it until I see more details. And that's not on James himself. I mean, I think James's book is one of the best books I've seen on trying to take seriously, the apparent contradictions in Christian theology. But to rely on an analogical account of theological language strikes me as going nowhere until the details are laid out. So
why don't we let James come in here?
Yeah. I mean, I have more to say there, but I'd like to hear James.
Yeah, I think if JC is familiar with the tradition on analogical language and he's tried his hardest to understand it and he doesn't understand it, I think it's unlikely I'm going to be able to say anything that's going to help him at this point. So this may just be a kind of a stalemate that we can't move beyond. Let me ask you, JC, though, do you think that analogy is a phenomenon in language in general? I mean, leave theology out of it, but the idea of terms being used in analogical ways, is that a coherent concept? For example, okay, I'll just throw out an example here. So let's talk about wisdom again, and we'll say Solomon is wise, and my dog is wise. Okay, something like that. Are those terms being used analogically, or do you just think that the idea of analogical predication is misguided in any context?
Again, I just don't really know what it is. I mean, I had, growing up with a lot of good dogs, I think some of them were wise. And is Solomon wise in the same way? Well, I don't know. And oftentimes when people use language analogically, and again, we're talking about within the created order. I mean, this thing is supposed to be a gap over which we cannot jump. That's part of why it's such a hard thing to even understand what's being proposed. But even if you restrict it to the created order, like my dog, I don't have a dog now, but a dog and Solomon. I think often these things are used either to, get somebody to experience something. They're not being used to try to give a true and accurate description. It's rather being used in a way to do something with the language, to get the listener to think something or feel something or something like that. If it is being used to give the cold hard truth about, my dog and King Solomon, then I'd want to say, okay, let's be clear about what are the satisfaction conditions for being wise. And then we can figure out, is the dog wise? For any given predicate, you can use it loosely in a way that's in effect equivalent to its being just a different predicate. So again, I think that sort of case is, I think there's analogical usage, but what that comes to is often not a sort of truth-driven usage. Instead, it's a sort of use in. Okay, I'm gonna think of imperatives, right? Stop. I mean, I'm not trying to say anything true. I'm trying to get you to do something. Analogical language sounds like it's trying to say something true, but I don't have a worked out theory of this, but I think oftentimes so-called analogical usage is just sort of like, it's analogous to, imperative usage, where you're just you're not worried about trying to truly describe the phenomenon. Rather, you're trying to just elicit some response or something like that.
Mm. I mean, my view is that language just is messy, and that often we use predicates, and we are affirming truths, but we maybe aren't able to specify what the truth conditions are. If I say my dog is wise, and I believe that's true, and you've no reason to doubt that what I'm saying is true, you take me at my word, and then you say, okay, so give me the truth conditions for your dog being wise. Okay. If I was a really, really good analytic philosopher, I might be able to do that, but your average person isn't going to be able to do that. But that doesn't seem like a reason to doubt that they're making a true statement, that they're using a language appropriately. And, I just see language as having that kind of fluidity and imprecision to it. And I think you, as a logician, you like predicates to be very precisely defined. You like to know what are the truth conditions for a statement, and in the context of doing high-level analytic philosophy, that's a virtue. That's a great thing. But I think in sort of ordinary theological language, religious discourse, we aren't that strict about things, and we can make statements like God is living and James Anderson is living, and we can, we can make these true statements, even if I can't specify. I mean, I can't even specify the truth conditions for James Anderson is living, to be honest. I don't think anyone else can. But nonetheless, I can say James Anderson is living and God is living, and these can both be true statements, and I can recognize that there's a similarity, but there's not a univocal relationship between those predicates.
Okay, but this is more to my point. First off, we completely agree that language is a fluid, dynamic, evolving sort of beast, and a very powerful one. But, the difference between somebody just saying my dog's wise and whatever, and somebody trying to give a precise account of the wisdom of God and the wisdom of humans, these are just different enterprises. And I think that there are a lot more responsibilities on the latter enterprise than there are in everyday discourse. You said way back before Cameron was asking you, he was commenting on the exchange we had initially, and then asking you follow-ups on your view. You wound up ending that with something like, the two of us both want to affirm the same claims. Christ is mutable and Christ is immutable. It's just that you resist the contradiction, and I think that you shouldn't. And I accept the contradiction. But actually, I think that that's misleading, and that's played out in your discussion of analogical. You don't know what claims you're even affirming. I mean, I'm affirming Christ is mutable and Christ is immutable. You say that, and at the same time, and anyone who's resting heavily on the analogical, says that, and then says, but I don't really know what I'm talking about. Now, this is explicit in sort of your unmarked equivocation. I forget the exact terms, but I mean, sure, people can go around saying all sorts of things and say that it's analogical and they don't understand the content of what they're saying, but they're going to say it. Hey, sure. I'm saying, though, again, until the details of what it is to be analogical predication, truth by analogy, these things have, they're just completely unfilled out. Until that stuff is done, I say, look, we say that Christ is fully divine, fully human. And that entails, I'm going to say, limited, unlimited, and, but pick whatever you want, explicit in the councils or not, fill it in. It's the same apparent contradiction that Christian thinkers, non-Christian theists, atheists, and others have seen. Why do they think there's a contradiction? Well, not because it's analogical. After all, to even know that there's a contradiction in the analogical language, you have to know a whole lot about what's going on with the satisfaction conditions of the predicates. So I think the difference is the analogical stuff is basically saying, I don't know what I'm saying. Now, of course, everyone will say, no, I do. It's kind of like when we say that Solomon is wise or Solomon is whatever. But look, we're talking about giving as precise as possible. Everyone thinks of a logician as sort of, what they absolutely love is chalkboard and chalk and everything. It has to look, neat and tidy. And, but no, I'm just saying, systematic theology should be getting as much of the truth as possible, and to kick it away and say that we don't even know the language we're speaking, except sort of when we think, well, it's sort of like what we say when we say this. I'm like, then don't say it. Like, just don't use that language. Just say, we have no idea what God is like. All we know is say this stuff. What's wrong with doing that? Then there's no apparent contradiction. You just say, we don't know the truth. I mean...
Well, I don't accept that characterization, because it seems to me that you're assuming that unless I know exactly what I'm saying, I don't know what I'm saying at all. And I don't think that's the case. I think we can use language, we can apply concepts, even if we don't exactly know what all the entailments of those concepts are. So, it's not all or nothing. It's not you must know exactly what you're saying or what these statements. Remember, it's not us that's coming up with these Christological statements, right? We're inheriting them from the church creeds, which I would argue are deriving them from scriptural revelation. So in a sense, we're not inventing the meanings of these, we're inheriting the meanings of these. But I think that the statements that we are receiving and that we want to affirm, and we can talk about why we want to affirm them in the first place, but these statements that we want to affirm, I don't need to know with maximal precision what they mean in order to truly affirm them and to justifiably affirm them.
Okay, agreed. And I was misleading in the way that I presented it. I don't know whether, I highly doubt that we will get the full truth about divine reality, human reality for that matter, let alone divine. So I'm not saying you have to know everything about the satisfaction conditions of every predicate and so on. What I am saying, though, is that when you say that God is wise or loving, and we say, well, loving entails this or that, and then there's an apparent issue. And then we say, well, when God loves, it doesn't have all those entailments. I sort of say, look, it's either the same predicate or it isn't. And you want to say, I'm going to use peccable and impeccable, which is not in the councils as far as I know, but it's clearly something that's been heavily discussed in the tradition. You know, when we say that Christ is impeccable, because God, so, you know, it's absolutely false that God can sin, which is all impeccable amounts to. So Christ being impeccable entails that Christ, it's false that Christ can sin. But Christ is human. So I'm not arguing for this. I'm just picking one example to get to. Okay. But because Christ is human, it's true that Christ can sin. So Christ is peccable. Now, if you accept, and this sort of brings us back to Cameron's initial question to you, if you accept, we could do this with mutable and immutable, probably should have, but I'll just stick with the peccability. If we accept that Christ is both peccable and impeccable, and you say, look, that looks contradictory, but it's not, I say, well, hold on. Peccability entails it's true that Christ can sin. Impeccability entails it's false that Christ can sin. That not only looks contradictory, it is contradictory. And you say, no, because those entailments don't go through. And we say, why? And you say, because the language is only being used in a way that's analogous, and we don't really know the full, or even, I want to say, we don't know much of the real content. And that to me looks like it's giving up the affirmation of these things.
Yeah, you know, I think something that we ought to bring into this discussion is how the definition of Chalcedon itself, which is basically the source for these Christological claims that we're discussing here, the definition of Chalcedon actually itself distinguishes between these attributes being according to the divine nature and according to the human nature. Now, the peccability issue, I'm not sure I would want to focus on that one. But let's go back to the immutability and mutability. So what Chalcedon says in effect is that Christ is one person in two natures, and that he is immutable according to his divine nature and mutable according to his human nature. Now, that's what the creed says. Now, we both think that is has seemingly contradictory implications, right? But it seems to me, though, that Chalcedon isn't just embracing univocal contradiction. It's actually trying to avoid it. It seems to me that what lies behind the development of this creed is an attempt to articulate an orthodox Christology in a way that doesn't capitulate to outright contradiction, doesn't just sort of say, yeah, and this is contradictory, end of story. Rather, it's introducing this conceptual apparatus of person and nature so that we can say things like, well, Christ is mutable according to his human nature, but immutable according to his divine nature. So, my position is trying to accommodate that. On the one hand, orthodoxy without simply saying embrace the contradiction, because it seems as though there's an impulse behind Chalcedon to actually not embrace outright contradiction or not embrace true contradictions, whereas your position is more, yes, they're just speaking univocally. Let's just accept they're speaking univocally, that the predicates are being used in the same sense, and it's a true contradiction. That's our simple solution, end of story.
Yeah. I think if they're not speaking univocally, then it's hard to avoid the charge that they were deeply irresponsible and sloppy. You don't have critical equivocations going unmarked if you're trying to truly describe a phenomenon. But I do agree with you. I think that, I'm not gonna try to get into the heads of these writers any more than the heads of the New Testament writers or anything else. You have what you have, and I think that they saw that the truth about Christ demands saying that Christ is fully divine and all that entails, and fully human and all that entails. And it then looks like that entails a contradiction. And you have claims that try to say, according to the human nature, according to the divine nature. You have claims in Leo's tome, and I know this from a friend and colleague, Tim Paul, that's more explicit. Christ can suffer, and it's false that Christ can suffer. Just very, very explicit. I think that look, these are human writers who may well have thought that they just can't see how the full truth avoids contradiction, but there are ways of saying it that at least don't obviously trip over the contradiction. But if they, again, I would say the same there. Either it's contradictory or make it plain how it's not. The heretics, these are sincere, truth-seeking thinkers that tried to show how it's not contradictory. Well, they're really two persons. Christ isn't God. Christ isn't human, and so on. That's perfectly good way of avoiding the contradiction. But it looks like you do it at the cost of giving the complete truth of Christ. To say that this language is being used, you don't have to worry about contradiction because it's being used only analogically, is basically to say, we don't know. It looks like you should say this. We don't know what it means, and I think that would be the height
that's
of your
close to what I'm saying. I'm not saying that we don't know what it means. I am saying we don't know how to explain that it's not actually contradictory. So there's a difference between saying I don't know what these claims mean, period. I can't tell you what they mean, or I can't tell you how they are logically consistent in a way that precisely distinguishes the predicates that are being used. Just a moment ago, you suggested that really either we have to say it's a true contradiction, or we have to say how it isn't, explain how it isn't a true contradiction. And that strikes me just as a false choice, because my position is in between those. It's saying that we affirm these, even though they appear to be contradictory, but we aren't able to articulate exactly why they aren't contradictory.
But what is it that we're affirming then?
Well, we're affirming the creedal statements, fundamentally. We're affirming the creedal statements, even though we can't specify exactly what the metaphysics is behind them that allows us to show that they are consistent.
Yeah. Well, it sure looks like, right, immutable, it's false that Christ can change, and mutable, it's true. So, unless you think that what I just said isn't entailed by those two, so we say Christ is mutable and Christ is immutable. Does that entail it's false that Christ can change, it's true that Christ can change?
Well, yes. That's what immutable and mutable mean. Immutable means cannot change. Mutable means can change.
So then we're affirming that it's true that Christ can change, it's false that Christ can change. And you are saying that this is not the contradiction that we're affirming. And that's where I just don't get it.
Well, what I'm going to say is that that's not all we want to say. We want to add to that Christ does not change according to his divine nature, but he does change according to his human nature. Now, if you ask me to spell out exactly what that means, I'm not able to do that because that's going to take us into some hairy metaphysics about how one person can instantiate, instantiate isn't the right term, but how one person can have both a divine nature and a human nature. And I'm saying that the metaphysics is beyond us. We cannot grasp the kind of metaphysics that would allow us to understand how one person can be mutable according to a human nature and immutable according to a divine nature. But there is an answer there, and I'm going to suggest that that answer is known to God and God alone. God grasps the metaphysics of the incarnation in a way that we don't, and that is why we are left with this residue of paradox, which we can't resolve without compromising the orthodoxy of our statements.
So we're about to get into Q&A. Yeah, go ahead.
No, that's fine.
Okay, yeah, and I want to push back to kick off the Q&A. I've got questions for each of you. And I've got a few people have sent in super chats, so we'll probably get to those. We'll see how far we can get. So here's the one for James. So I mean, you've got to be saying that there is, if you want to say that there is no true contradiction, when you say that Christ is mutable, Christ is not mutable, or immutable, Christ is immutable, you've got to say that one of those propositions is false, right? To avoid the contradiction, because if you say that both of them are true, in the same sense, then you've got a contradiction. So you've got to reject one of them. And I think that you would say that it's false if by immutable we mean the negation of mutable, but that's not what we mean. That's not what you're saying is the true contradiction, or the two propositions that are true are not two propositions that are sort of the mirror image of each other, right? But you still want to say that the proposition that Christ is immutable is false. I want to get that. I want to make that clear if that's what you're saying.
No. When I say that Christ is mutable and Christ is immutable, so let's just say that immutable means not mutable. What I'm saying is that there is a sense in which Christ is mutable, and there is a sense in which he is not mutable, and these pertain to his divine and human natures. Can I specify the difference between the sense in which Christ is mutable and is not mutable? No, I can't. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a way of understanding these terms in the ideal sense that we don't have access to.
Would you say that then you're also using analogical language when you're referring to Jesus or Christ being mutable? Are you using analogical language in both cases?
I mean, I think the analogical language comes in most when we speak about God and when we speak about the divine nature. So, when we say that Christ is mutable, I mean that in exactly the same sense that I'm mutable. I change, I age, and so forth. When Christ is not mutable, that's with respect to his divine nature. But again, it's the question here for me is how the divine and human natures are united in one person. That seems to be the nub of the problem, and that's a metaphysical problem. I don't really think that that's a logical problem. It's a metaphysical problem, but it has implications for what we're able to say about Christ as this divine human person, and it means that we're going to have to accept some paradoxical statements. But I don't think there's anything more that can be said about it.
Yeah, and I want to move on from that because I don't think that's actually the crux of the disagreement between the two of you. I think that the crux is this analogical stuff, which takes me to my question for JC. Don't you use words in your everyday language that you don't fully know all of the necessary and sufficient conditions for? Just take the term knowledge. Like, do you have a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for that? And if you don't, do you use that word in your everyday language? And if you do, then what gives? Because it seems like that you're doing the same thing that James is doing. And knowledge is just one example. So you can if you have, think of some other example.
Sure. In no way did I intend to claim that we have to use that we understand the full meaning of our predicates and so on. The satisfaction conditions or true of conditions in full. I'm not even sure. I think that a lot of the conditions have vague boundaries for many of the predicates in our language. So just to be clear, that though is not really the issue. The issue is when you go to make a claim on the settled core of the satisfaction conditions, and by that I mean, so take knowledge, right? You think that the settled core is justified true belief. Gettier, right, said there's more, but that's a sort of settled core. So if you know something, okay, you're justified, you believe it, it's true. These are all entailments. Focus only on the settled core of the Christological predicates. That's how the fundamental problem of Christology, the apparent contradiction, arises in the first place. It's from the settled core.
This is super helpful.
James's response is that the settled core is not what we think it is. The entailments don't go through. James, if I'm incorrect there, tell me. But that's the way I'm understanding it, because otherwise you would be claiming that it's true that Christ can change and false that Christ can change. You say, in some sense, it's true that Christ can change. In some sense, it's false. But then we don't know what we're talking about. I mean, I think in some sense, I'm an all-star baseball player. Now you say, in what sense? Well, give me time. I realize it's not that ludicrous, but I just don't.
Yeah,
it just
that's a
seems
funny
like
example.
when you go to the
Maybe this will help. JC, I think when we reflect on these claims, you and I have basically got the same kind of content in our heads. We're still understanding these terms in the same way, but the difference is you want to say we know them well enough to be able to say that there's a real contradiction here, whereas I'm saying that this content that we have, this semantic content when we reflect on these claims, is not precise enough for us to be able to say that there really is a true contradiction. So when you say, I don't really know what these claims mean, I do. I think I'm interpreting them in the same way that you do. But what I'm also thinking at the same time is that I don't understand these statements in a maximally precise way that would allow me to say, yes, this is a true contradiction. And in fact, I have countervailing reasons to believe that there isn't a true contradiction here.
But it's not the precision. I think that that's actually misleading us. I may be wrong, but I don't think that's the issue. It's rather, it looks like, according to you, the true theory of Christ contains the claim it's true that Christ can change, and it's false that Christ can change. Because you think that the true theory of Christ contains Christ is mutable and Christ is immutable. And you think that the meanings of the settled core of those predicates is sufficient to give it's true that Christ changes, it's false that Christ changes. You say then that, how this can avoid being contradictory is something beyond us. I just don't see how it can avoid being contradictory. I mean, if that's logical negation there, it's false that Christ can change, and then the other sentence is it's true that Christ can change. I mean, if this theology is closed under classical logic, everything follows. And in the end, if it's not closed under logic at all, then we don't need the analogical stuff or the epistemic stuff or metaphysical stuff at all. You just affirm these things and don't worry about the logical consequences. So that's where I get, it has nothing to do with sort of precision. It's what's actually in the theory being claimed.
This is very, very high level stuff. James, I want to give you one more chance to come back in on that, and then we got to move to some audience questions.
I'm not sure what to say in response to that. I mean, I could maybe talk about some of the illustrations that I use in the book to try and explicate what I mean by these apparent contradictions and this unarticulated equivocation. I don't want to fill up the time with that. People can look that up for themselves. So, back to you if you think that there are some good questions here for us to field.
Yeah, there are. There's a bunch of good ones. Okay, let's start with this one. Furthering.
I probably have to go in about 5 or 10 minutes. That's all.
Oh, okay. So we'll get through these as quickly as we can. Dr. Anderson, do you think the epistemological backdrop of your model, proper function, and the extended AC model could be used to justify belief in a contradiction?
That's interesting. Yes, it could in principle. Yes, the epistemology that I adopt is certainly consistent with the claim that there are true contradictions. I'm just not sure whether I have sufficient grounds to go there, and I think I have, as I say, some countervailing reasons not to go there. But there's nothing in the proper function epistemology per se that rules out there being true contradictions or rational belief in true contradictions. So that answers the question, I think.
Yeah. Question from BDS. I see directly by the concept of negation that there are no true contradictions, no square circles. Is it arrogant to claim to have this basic sight? Either one of you guys.
It's first off, that you see that there are no square circles, you see from the true theory of geometry. That's not a logical matter. That's by definition what a square and a circle are, and the way that the geometry is closed. That you see directly by the concept of negation, that there's no true contradiction. That has nothing to do with arrogance as far as I know, but a misunderstanding of what the truth and falsity conditions are. Even in classical logic, a negation is true if and only if its negatum is false. A negation is false if and only if its negatum is true. Those just are the truth and falsity conditions of logical negation. And those biconditionals are completely compatible with a sentence P being neither true nor false. It just means that its logical negation is too, given the meaning of negation. And it's compatible with a sentence P being both true and false. It just means that its negation is true and false too, given the meaning of negation. So I don't think it's arrogance, but I think it's just wrong on both fronts.
James, unless you've got anything to add, we'll just do the last question here.
I would just say I agree with JC on this. You can't get classical logic just from the concept of negation, because subclassical logics rely on the concept of negation just as much. So philosophy isn't that easy, unfortunately.
Right.
All right, here's the last question, Anglican aesthetics. And this one looks like a tough one. If a physical object is non-referential, it's just a physical object, why not construe gluts as physical objects to which other sentences refer? Someone's going to have to interpret this for me too.
I suppose that I'm not sure I'm completely getting it, and I'm disappointed because it sounds very interesting. But I suppose maybe the person has something like a liar phenomenon in particular in mind, and a sort of non-glutty solution, which would be that given the sentence, which is a physical object, it's not actually referential, but instead other sentences refer to it, and you get around the glut that way. I don't know. I'm disappointed. I don't see the question more clearly because it sounds interesting, but I'm sorry.
Well, what I can do.
I think I may know what this question is getting at. I think that the claim that physical objects are non-referential, the point here is that a physical structure doesn't have intentionality in the way that a mental object does, a thought. So physical things don't refer in and of themselves. They don't have intrinsic intentionality. They do not refer. So that claim is clear. I agree with that. But why not construe gluts as physical objects? Well, I think the reason for that is that gluts are propositions. They're propositions that are neither true nor false. And I don't think that a proposition can be a physical object. If any proposition can be true or false, then a proposition as such in its nature can't be a physical object, because some propositions clearly do refer and they do have truth values, and no physical object has a truth value. So I think that's a non-starter. Does that make sense to you, JC?
It does. Well, you're asking him, but it does to me too.
Thank you, Cam. According to Cam, it makes sense to me. But yeah, no, a lot of what you said, James, is correct as far as I can see. But thanks. The question's interesting for sure.
Well, I just wanted to say thanks for both of you guys coming on and discussing this. This was a long time coming. We've been trying to plan this for a long time. I appreciate both of you guys being patient on the scheduling on this discussion, but I think it was very fruitful. I learned a lot throughout this discussion. It was just very, very good. It was good in a lot of ways. So just thanks to both of you for coming on.
Thanks. It's a real pleasure.
Thanks to you for having us, and to James. I think that this was a great conversation. I really enjoyed it, and I think I learned a lot. So thank you.
Likewise. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, all right. We will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video, which will be out soon. So keep your eyes open for it when it comes out. But see you next. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please